So welcome to this evening's event, Imagining the Divine, Art and the Rise of World Religions, organised by Torch, the Ashmolean Museum and Empires of Faith. We're delighted to have with us this evening three distinguished, world-renowned, widely published academics: Mary Beard, Professor of Classics at Cambridge University; Neil MacGregor, Director of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin; and Mallica Kumbera Landrus, who is Keeper of Eastern Art at the Ashmolean Museum. My name is Philip Bullock, and I'm Director of Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, and Professor of Russian Literature and Music here. Tonight's event is the fruit of a fantastic collaboration between the Empires of Faith project, the Ashmolean Museum, the British Museum, and Torch. Over the course of the last 5 years, an interdisciplinary group of researchers from the University of Oxford has worked with the British Museum to examine the religious imagery and iconographies that emerged in different religious traditions across Asia and Europe in the period 200 to 800 AD. Funded by the Leverhulme Trust and supported by the Ashmolean Museum and Torch, and led by Professor Yash Elsner, this project has aimed to put the best of current research on late antique religious history and archaeology at the University of Oxford, side by side with the unparalleled scholarly and material resources of the British Museum. Out of Empires of Faith have come Imagining the Divine exhibition at the Ashmolean, and those who follow, a photographic exhibition of Oxford's local religious sites. At Torch, we've also hosted 2 book at lunchtime discussions on the project's publications, so we're all the more thrilled to be here this evening. We're also very glad to welcome several school and community groups, including Cheney Sixth Formers and the Croydon High School. As a reminder, we are filming and live streaming, so welcome to our audiences nationally and internationally beyond these walls. The video will subsequently be available on the Torch website. It's a privilege to be opening this event in such excellent company on stage and in the theatre, and to be handing over to Mallica to chair the subsequent discussion. Before I do so, however, on behalf of everyone involved in tonight's proceedings, I'd like to thank our funders, sponsors, and collaborators, in particular the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Oxford University Diversity Fund, as well as the exhibition's funders, including the Leverhulme Trust, the British Museum, the Ruddock Foundation for the Arts, the Sarikani family, the patrons of the Ashmolean Museum, and Richard and Jacqueline Worswick. At Torch, we believe passionately in facilitating high-quality interdisciplinary research and encouraging wider public engagement with that research. That is why we've been so keen to make this evening's event free and accessible to all, and we will continue to open doors across disciplinary boundaries and do our utmost to connect diverse audiences with humanities research. And so now I have the great pleasure of handing over to Mallica. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. When I was asked to chair this event, I hesitated at first. For how does one come up with questions for 2 of our most important public intellectuals who speak compellingly of our past and our present, who've made the complexities and broad scope of material culture interesting for academics and the general audiences, who've balanced intellectual and popular subjects without compromising either interest. So despite my trepidations, I'm deeply honored to be here, particularly in this setting and in this distinguished company. Such is the popularity of our participants that the event was sold out within hours of being announced. That much overused statement, our speakers need no introduction, I'm sure we all agree is absolutely true today. It is my honor to welcome Mary Beard, Professor of Classics at Cambridge and the author of a long list of publications, including her most recent book, Women and Power, a Manifesto. Mary is part of the new BBC series, Civilizations, which will be broadcast in the spring. It is also my privilege to welcome Neil MacGregor, former director of the National Gallery and the British Museum in London, the presenter of the series, A History of the World in 100 Objects, which was accompanied by a corresponding exhibition and publication. He has received numerous awards, including the Friedrich Gundolf Prize, the German National Prize, and the Goethe Medal in 2015. It is a delight to have them here. Please, would you join me in welcoming both Mary and Neil this evening? So today's event is designed to coincide with the current exhibition at the Ashmolean, Imagining the Divine. And if there's still anybody in this room who hasn't been there yet, you have 1 month to the date. 17th February is the last date. Getting to questions around the exhibition, the closer religious groups get to defining what the divine is, it would seem that the divine becomes more controversial. So my question to both of you is, what does it make to make an image of the divine, and why are the representations of gods so controversial? Who wants to go first?
Am I going first?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to go first with a really big overgeneralization to annoy Neil. I think I want to say that all religions make images. They may not make figurative images, but they all imagine the divine in material form, very occasionally slightly odd material form to us, like fire. Religious image making isn't an option for religion. It's absolutely central and essential. And why is it central and essential? It's because I think at the bottom line, all religions have to find a way to bridge the gap between, I'm using these terms advisedly, and there'd be religions in which they wouldn't quite work, but faith and knowledge, right? Religions never add up. Religions are the most cognitively underdetermined as well as overdetermined kind of things that exist in the world, and they need images to make themselves true. So images are the essential way, and they come in many different forms, of making religions not just be faith, but be true. That's my pitch,
Yeah.
Neil?
Well, I would of course disagree with that, because it seems to me that religions are about two things. First of all, they're about a story, and they're a story that is an image. The point of a religion is the story of where we are, you are, all of us are, and how we relate to things we can't see, and how we relate to time past and time not yet. That's a story that is about something that we don't understand. So it's no surprise that it's cognitively underdeveloped. It's about the things we can't understand, the things beyond. And one of the ways you can give form to that, other than just the words that can keep changing, is the image. Because the image will let you put together things that can't be together in the real world. The image will let you put the impossible into physical form and let you think differently about the different parts of the world. How should they fit together? How might they fit together? How ought they to fit together? And that's why the image is so important, and it's why it's impossible.
It's why it's an impossible task. You know, images are essential, but we're asking them within any religious community to do the impossible, which is to square the circle. And therefore, they are inevitably controversial, because how you square the circle has to be. And I think that one of the things that the Ashmolean show really demonstrates is that the kind of sense that most of us, me included, often go around with, which is somehow that what these images are doing are illustrating religions, that they're illustrative in some ways. That is absolutely fundamentally to underestimate what images do in any religious sense. They invent what it is to illustrate.
I think that's exactly right. The tradition, of course, is long before there's a written tradition anywhere. You have the image. And as Mary says, we've all been brought up, I think, on that reductive notion in religious terms of the illustration. I can't be the only person here who remembers their Sunday school childhood Bibles with illustrations of Abraham leading people, everybody wearing rather peculiar dressing gowns, as apparently they all did in the Old Testament, heading through the desert, telling you nothing beyond what late 19th century people thought that meant. That's, of course, not what the image is about at all. In the exhibition, which I think is magnificent, the things it puts together, one image that I think goes exactly to the heart of what Mary is saying. There's a wonderful image of the Indian god Vishnu. And Vishnu is precisely that attempt to pull the different bits of the world together, so that Vishnu is, of course, in human form. He's a god, more or less, in the sense we use that word. He's also a boar, he's a fish, and whatever. Now, in one statue, you can put all that together. You can have a being who is both human and animal, and all of that's divine. That's an amazing bit of what Mary's saying, the image doing the work. What that's saying is that the divine is not limited to the human in that way that all the Abrahamic religions insist that only the humans have got this, and then the animals different. It all runs together, flows together, and only an image can do that. And as you look at it, you can think differently about that. In what sense is a wild boar divine? Or is the divine like a wild boar? And it takes you into a whole realm of thought that words really couldn't. And why it's so important for us, I think, is that because of our tradition, most of us in this room are actually brought up in an Abrahamic faith tradition, the idea that these things are fluid, open, changing, and that the boundaries of the human, the animal, the divine aren't set. That's something an image can do, much better than words.
But are also always deeply and furiously contested, not just between religions, but within religions. I mean, I'm going to apologize for this in advance, I tend to go back to the ancient classical world for some of my examples. And, I think there, in the debates of the 5th and 4th century BC in Greece, you see some of those controversies about images, at their rawest. And the Greeks were sitting down and they were negotiating, just as we have for centuries after, what actually constituted, therefore, a good image of the divine. And so you can see all kinds of rival traditions existing in the classical world about how you make the goddess Athena look. Is she that disgustingly revolting, colossal, superhuman creation out of gold and ivory in the Parthenon, which, we believe people admired, but must have looked absolutely horrible, but was, in a sense, trying to capture the nature of divinity by being huge and shiny and sparkling and, answering in one very, very loaded way, what does a goddess actually look like? Or you can do this actually by just staying on the Acropolis in Athens, and you can go a couple of 100 yards away from this vast, shiny, colossal golden ivory creation, and you can find an olive wood plank, which was supposed to have fallen from heaven one day, a very long time ago, before we ever even kind of knew about where it came from, but is actually the real divine gift from the heavens kind of image of Athena, which then proceeded to dress up with all kinds of clothes and quotes, put it in a temple. And there are just, as it were, two of the options you get for saying, what does a god look like?
Because it becomes more complicated, I think, doesn't it, when your God speaks to you. As far as I know, Athena doesn't, on the whole, say how she is to be shown very often. But once you have a God who says, no images, you don't get to see me, that complicates things.
I think Athena makes her views known somehow.
How?
Dreams.
Oh, of course.
Yes. Gods can always come in dreams and show you how they should be seen.
But it does, of course, become very complicated once you have a God that says no images. and who, if you're very good, Moses, I'll allow you to see my back once, very quickly. And that's it. And no image. And this sets up, I think, a really fascinating tension. Once you start with the idea that the divine is so big that it can't be visualized, you then have a real problem, rather than so complex and fluid and variable that it must be seen everywhere. And that's then the problem of the image that must not be seen.
And you could have all kinds of versions of that. My Athena plank, is going towards that. But you have to feel very sorry for the Romans at the end of the Hannibalic War, when they decided, thanks to an oracle, they were instructed that in order to defeat Hannibal, they should bring to Rome the goddess, the Great Mother from Asia Minor, from where Rome, by all the myths, had originated, near Troy. No, they send off this great expedition and they go to the temple at Pessinus and they bring back the goddess, the Great Mother. And there were all kinds of things that were a problem about the goddess Great Mother, including the fact that she came with her own retinue of self-castrated priests, which rather upset Roman sensibilities. But even more, it was that the image of the Great Mother was just a blob, right? It was a black, probably meteorite, which presumably at one level had fallen from heaven, and they think they are getting a goddess in anthropomorphic terms, and they get a stone.
And of course, the exact opposite of that is when you eventually decide, the Christians eventually decide, that they should make an image of Jesus. This becomes really a problem. Here you have a real person, and nobody knows what he looked like. But you've got to make an image. You've got to make a portrait. And it's what you do. Well, of course, perfectly obvious, you forge a description. So you forge a description of what he should look like, and then you make it. But that's another area, I think, the controversial divine is such an interesting one, because you've got to choose, if you go for any god or goddess, what colour is their skin? What do they look like?
Why does the Virgin Mary always wear blue? That was something that I always wondered about when I was a child. Why blue?
Exactly.
Right?
So from must not be seen to no images, blob. What at the most basic level are religious images for then? Is there something different about religious images and non-religious images?
Can we go one back and ask whether it is a religious image? I think the first three-dimensional object you see in the Ashmolean exhibition is of the bust of a man with a sheep round his neck. And is that a religious image or not? Or is it just a man with a sheep round his neck? I don't know enough about shepherding to know whether that's the normal way of carrying your flock around. But maybe it is, and maybe it's just that, or maybe it's about flocks or whatever. But of course, if it is the Good Shepherd, then it's a religious image, and you use it in a different way. And instead of you being the human, which you would normally do when you're identifying with the image, you become the sheep, and so on. So I think the first thing is, who is looking? Because that decides whether it's a religious image or not.
And in a way, it means, and I think this is what this show is very good at helping you see, it means that what would now be taken for granted within art history, which is the perspective of the viewer, is crucially important in looking at images and in a sense, making images mean something. And in the art of religion and the art of faith, the perspective of the viewer is not just very important, is absolutely determinate of what you see. And we know that in all kinds of ways. We know when we go to the National Gallery and we see some rather nice Renaissance painting which had once been over an altar, we know that it is meaning something different to the largely secular viewership that is walking in front of it and maybe admiring its brushstrokes from how that picture was seen when it was behind the altar in the local parish church. And in some ways, and in saying that, I don't want in any sense to say, oh, religious art is only worth looking at if you can recreate the religious experience of its first view, as that's clearly not the case. We might as well give up with Renaissance art if we thought that. But there are really important ways in which you've got that extra dimension of saying, so what difference does it make when I see this, and it is in the church or the temple, the prayer hall or whatever?
I think that idea of the purpose is an interesting one. And one of the things images do, I think, is focus you. They settle you, they let you think about what that God is, what that God means, in a way that's you are in charge of how you're thinking. So it's quite different from a sermon about or a book about. As you look at a particular treatment, and there are several objects in the exhibition that shows, you have to think, what does that aspect of the God mean? Why am I being shown this particular image and what's beside it? In the exhibition is what's probably the oldest representation known of the crucifixion. And there on the cross is Jesus standing, a little ivory plaque about that size. And Jesus on the cross, standing, not in pain, not in distress, triumphing over the whole thing. And it immediately makes you think quite differently from the way we've all been brought up to think about that particular moment, if we've been brought up to think about it, that how you can read that event. And the image lets you read the event, think about the event in a very different way.
I'm going to give you a possibly rival example for the first ever crucifixion, but one which I think adds to this sense of controversy, because there has been found on the Palatine Hill in Rome an image which, of uncertain date, Yash might help me out, let's say 2nd and 3rd century AD. And what it is, if it is that, and there are some doubts about it, it's a cross, and on the cross is being crucified a man with a donkey's head. Now, one issue has always been about that image, and if it is in some sense an attempt to image the crucifixion of Jesus, then it's all very likely to be the very earliest image of the crucifixion we have, but it's then already a parody. And in a sense, it is already someone undermining the scene. And in fact, in Greek around it says, the name of the guy is so-and-so worships his God. Now, if this is not quite what it seems, which some people have thought, then you can see that at the very moment that Christian art is born, it's born in parody. And I think that's quite unsettling, if true.
Obviously, I would prefer to think of the British Museum plaque as the oldest one.
Surprise, surprise.
It's also a much better thing.
Well, it is certainly prettier.
Yeah, but there's another aspect of using the image, why you make them, that I find very puzzling in the ancient world, that Mary will, I'm sure, will be able to explain. The idea that you make an image of, particularly something like Artemis, Diana of the Ephesians of Ephesus, the statue with many, many breasts, or are they breasts, but looks there, many breasts. The great protecting goddess of the city of Ephesus. And you go to the shrine, you buy a little image of the goddess. It's another of those ones that came down from heaven. It was thrown down direct. Zeus delivered it. So that's what she looks like, authenticated image. You make an image of the goddess, and then you present it to her, in her shrine. And I found it a very puzzling and interesting thing. I don't know whether Mary's Facebook fans send her photographs of her, which would be the same thing. I mean, contemporary goddesses have to be venerated in the in the way we venerate them. But what is going on? Why do you give to the god an image of the god? The god presumably knows what she looks like already. And what's it about?
In some way, it's going back to the problem we started at, isn't it? It's actually a reassertion that is what the god or goddess looks like, isn't it? You're right. You don't expect Artemis to say, "Oh, so that's what I look like then." What it's doing is it's underlining, putting into bold that image. At the same time as you yourself are validating it. I mean, I think there's an awful lot of ancient pagan classical religious experience which is about how the person, the normal human mortal, how they, in a sense, write themselves into the divine world. And those kind of relationships of exchange, of apparently solipsistic gift-giving, must in some way, I think, be part of that.
I think that takes another point that you asked about why they're made. I mean, we can all imagine, of course, the image in the temple or on the altar in front of which sacrifices are made, whatever. But also the idea of being able to make an image of the divine you can take home and that can live with you is surely a very important part of this. It's certainly later on. The exhibition effectively ends around 800, but obviously later on, particularly in all traditions, the idea of being able to bring the divine into the house and live every day with the divine is a critical reason for making the image of the god, that it lives with you. It's part of your everyday life.
And again, it goes on to validate a certain version of divine essence, of divine appearance. I mean, I think it's very hard for me to go back to the classical world and really recapture that sense of the fragility and the fleetingness of what a god or goddess might be like. How do we talked about dreams. How do you recognize a god who comes in a dream? There are all these kind of wonderful stories of people who, in their dreams or in real life, meet gods and goddesses. But how do you know you have? And there are vague hints that you always get. Things like, young man goes to a river, there's an old lady wanting to cross the river, he's a decent young guy. He thinks, I'll give her a lift, the river's a bit in flood, there's no bridge, I'll carry her across. And he thinks, wow, she smells nice. And then he lifts her up, and she's as light as a feather. It was no trouble at all. And I think, God, it was Venus all along. She might have been looking like an old lady, but she was Venus. And so we tend, I think, possibly, I think our reasonable fixation on images tend actually to make us forget there are other things about recognizing gods and goddesses, which is like the smell.
Yeah. This is one final thing about the image. The fascination, I think, of the image is that, particularly when we don't know what the faith is, how bewildering it is, how absolutely bewildering it is. If that's all we have, trying to work out what's going on. The object in the exhibition that is most striking, that is the Manafith cross. It's a Scottish cross, and on one side is a carved cross, and on the back are Pictish emblems of Pictish religion. And they're discs, circles, concentric circles, which is a fairly normal notion. But then there's a comb. And, well, I know the Scots and personal hygiene have always had a complicated relationship, but the idea of a comb as somehow an emblem of the divine is what's wonderful about these images. It lets you ask questions you could never get to otherwise.
And just to stick with the exhibition, there's another wonderful image which reminds me more than anything else of the complete lack of fixity and the complete sort of dependence on the viewer that you have in these images. It's Rubens's large, an enlarged copy of the great cameo of France, which we now recognize to be a scene of the Roman imperial court with a couple of emperors now become gods on the top level and some poor benighted barbarians at the bottom. It's one of the prime pieces of pagan cameo art from the ancient world, 1st century CE, and Rubens copies it. What the label, I think, doesn't say, though it's in the catalogue, is that Rubens and his mates were the first people for hundreds of years to get the identity of this right, because it's in France, and it had for centuries been assumed to be an image of Joseph at the Egyptian court of the Pharaoh. Now, if you look at it, I mean, I think it's wonderfully destabilizing, because the impossibility now for us to look at this and to see how you could think that this bog standard piece of classical pagan imagery had been thought to be a biblical scene is a wonderful reminder of precisely how the viewer makes a difference, how it isn't pinned down, and how, you like with your Pictish cross, the sense of you can really make this mean something different in a way that is inconceivable.
Lots of great points there. Making religion mean something. Who is looking to emperors who've become gods? What are the objects in the exhibition that tell us about politics?
There are so many.
All of them.
All of them.
All of them.
And Mary's just mentioned the one of the Roman emperor on earth with Augustus, the previous Roman emperor in heaven, the emperor who becomes the god. It's wonderful all the way through. You have the images of the emperor. It's impossible really to know whether you're looking at an emperor or Jupiter or Zeus. And the way that imagery moves backwards and forwards is fascinating. And then right at the end, you have an Anglo-Saxon, a 12th century English manuscript, where the kings of England trace their descent from Adam, of course, as all of us, but through the Norse god Odin, Woden. So Odin descends from Adam, and they all wind up somehow as kings of England. It's that marvelous sense of the religious authority becoming the political authority, and somehow you take it over. And you can do it better in images than any other way, presenting yourself in the form of a god, Alexander, obviously, so that, and emperors who are gods, rulers who are divine. It's still with us. It's absolutely still with us.
I think it's another case where, sorry to harp on this, the classical world is quite illustrative for us and instructive, because I think that, from school history, we are brought up to find the divine right of kings slightly problematic. And there's, in day-to-day usage now, modern world religions, by and large, not all, but by and large, tend to have a fairly clearly demarcated boundary between gods and the rest. There are some fuzzy areas. The Trinity is a frightful difficulty. But in a day-to-day basis, we think of gods as somehow separate. God, particularly, the more monotheistic, the more separate God is. And I think that one of the things you see if you look at religions who operate differently, and classical polytheism would be one, is that, look, we're dealing here with various versions of power. And divine power is absolutely crucially important, but there isn't actually a firmly demarcated boundary between humanity and mortals and the gods. Mortals can become immortals. Ordinary people can become gods. And indeed, although we tend to kind of snigger at it because we were taught to snigger at it by the early Christians who themselves thought it was a kind of useful bit of ammunition against paganism. Of course, the power of the emperor can, after his death, be literally, in Roman terms, turned into divine power. And I think it's one of those kind of cases where you have to think outside yourselves, really, because to us, we've always been taught that was silly. How could you possibly imagine that? The emperor died. Silly old Emperor Claudius dies in his bed, and then the next minute we see him whizzing up to heaven to join the gods. How silly is that? But actually, what's going on here is some attempt to think about how power is divided in the world, and that there is no absolute separation between divine power and human power. There is a spectrum and a fuzzy boundary, and in many ways the images are already telling you that. When the image of the Roman emperor makes him look like you're not sure whether he's Jupiter, that's making an important intellectual point. It's not just being boastful.
And the point you're making about the absurdity of the emperor becoming the god is, of course, something that's so important that the Christians take it over absolutely as the rulers becoming saints. I mean, the King of France becomes St. Louis. Nobody seems to find that strange, particularly not the French. But every royal family needs its saint, exactly in the same model. And I think Mary's point is interesting. In the exhibition, you can see it in the coins, where you've got the ruler on one side and the god on the other. And you can see that in Indian coinage as well as in other traditions. But the power, the real power over human life and human death, is something that flows through the political into the religious and can't really be separated. And you want to draw on that power in every way possible.
And we have a tendency casually to talk about the politicization of religion now. There has never been a moment in the history of the world in which the power of religion hasn't been a political force for somebody. And of course, I don't actually think that's anything to complain about particularly.
And where that image becomes interesting, of course, if you're thinking about politics and power, is on the coinage after the arrival of Islam. Because it's quite clear that, of course, after a certain date, an Islamic coin cannot have an image either of the ruler or, of course, of God. So what you have on one side is maybe the name of the ruler, and then on the other side, you have a Quranic text. And that does something very fascinating, because it again links the political power to the religious in a way that is beyond just one particular area. And how that fusion of the political and the religious on the coin, but in the Islamic world, operates is, I think, very, very interesting and very important.
That leads us, so kings of England presenting ourselves in the guise of gods. We can do it better in images. Fuzzy boundaries, it's great. What are then the key aspects of religion that we cannot address in an exhibition?
I think that's really interesting because, this is not an attack on this exhibition or any exhibition, but I think it is really interesting. And again, it goes back to thinking about who's looking and also in what context they are looking. That as soon as the institution of the museum chooses, interestingly, to display the images of religion, there's two things that happen. One is, inevitably, it is it is deracinated from its original context, and we can, I think I can get over that. We have to remember constantly its original context, but I can get over it. What I think is interesting is, of course, the exhibition inevitably shows you the art with a capital A of religion. And if you think about the kind of images that we've been talking about, I'm sure there are some people here who haven't been to the show yet. Don't go expecting to see any planks. There is no Zoroastrian fire in the corner, which is also an image of the divine, that in a sense, the exhibition inevitably excludes those bits of religious imagery which doesn't easily fit in to our view of what imagery worth being in a museum means. So I would love to have an exhibition of religious imagery which was all planks and blobs, right?
And flames.
And flames.
What's missing in that sense, and this is a direct attack on the director of the Ashmolean. Yeah, you go into an exhibition about religion in the ancient world. Where is the sacrificial animal? Where is the smell of roasting meat? The smoke rising to the gods? The absolutely central part of a religious experience, the smoke of sacrifice, the burning of the sacrifice. That's the image, a central part of the image of contact, of connection between the human and the divine. And then you all eat what's left. It would be terrific. You've got a restaurant just next door. It could all have been managed. It could have been managed. And it's, of course, inevitably, as Mary says, you can only exhibit what you can exhibit, not only what survived, but the things. And that does risk, of course, narrowing the focus of the debate, that these are all, not just that they're part of a temple or whatever, but also part of a set of activities which would have had, above all, smell and noise. And you would have known where the temple was because you'd have smelt the animals being slaughtered and burnt. These are critical bits of engaging with the divine for most of history.
And just to talk about the classical world, not to cast any aspersions on the other religions that are represented in this exhibition, it makes the classical religion seem much less weird than it really was. By getting it and putting it in cases and having it as kind of sculpture that we know we should admire. It's not just the smell and the blood and the guts. Where's the oracles? Where are the mad miracles? Where's the 100-breasted Artemis? We have here a very kind of calm sort of view of religion that you can take a child to, right? It doesn't have an X rating, right? There's no little kind of godlets sleeping with goats or anything like that we know happened. No incest, nothing. It's all frightfully sort of okay. Suburban. It's a very suburban view of Roman religion, I'm afraid. You could have one of those Serapices in your garden. It'd be fine, absolutely fine. Then Neil could come along, do a sacrifice.
Mary's point is a really important one. It's because the objects are, particularly the classical world, because we've studied them in a particular context and familiar with them as objects and as art. It has a rationality and a restraint which is terribly misleading. Terribly misleading. Yeah. And there's no way around that.
Classical religion was bonkers. And I would almost dare to say that, in a sense, the pejorative way of putting what I said at the beginning, which is there's always a kind of cognitive gap in religion. That's me being analytical and fair and even-handed and sensible. You could say religion, what religions are always bonkers, and they need images somehow to stop them seeming so. The secularist would say that images help the cat of religion keep in the bag. Right?
It's a complex image, right?
So
Think
what?
about it. It was quite profound.
What are the consequences then of not having images?
That's again something you can't really examine in the exhibition. What happens when you don't allow it and don't have it? But it is, of course, very, very profound. It forces you onto words. If we're talking about essentially the Abrahamic faiths, it forces you into words, and that catastrophically then forces you into texts, and that opens the way to academics.
Hooray.
And the rest, sadly, is not silence, but endless quarrelling. And the disastrous consequence of not having images is that you have lawyers and scholars fighting over the meaning of words.
Now, I'm going to disagree.
So we should be very, very grateful for the image religions. What it does also, of course, is it allows, very easily, it allows your gods to move. It's much easier to proselytize for a god without specific images, I think. Otherwise, you have to keep changing your image as you travel, because the image has to change to adapt to the people on the other side. But it's above all that, I think, it takes you into the word, which can become, of course, decorative, as we know, but it takes you into ideas, language, and fights about the nature of the Trinity, from which we would have been rescued had the early church, I think, had proper images.
I think, for once, I slightly disagree. I think it's very interesting that you have, and we often have made that slippage between image and figurative image, right? So there are some religions without images. Well, I think I want to say there are no religions without images. Very often the word is an image. You only have to look at Islamic calligraphy to see, in a sense, precisely. It's not just, and I think you're wrong to say it's decorative. It's actually an image of God. And you can, whether you choose to have that from the Gospels, God is the word, if you see calligraphy as picturing God who exists as word, then you see it as an image. And my own kind of low-level sub-Christian upbringing has taught me to think about it as figurative images, as the Virgin Mary in her blue, and all these Old Testament characters in their dressing gowns. But there are different ways of having images, and fire is another one. Not only Zoroastrian fire, but we were talking about this a few months ago, the fire in the temple of Vesta in Rome. What did people say about the goddess Vesta in Rome? They said, because they also were into figurative images, they say, oh, she doesn't have an image, she just has a flame. Now, try thinking about that flame as the goddess Vesta. The closest approximation you can get to this peculiar divine character. And then you don't see it as imageless or image-free. I mean, I also think that it is just as possible, though we tend not to see it written down, you can argue as furiously about the nature of the image as you can about the nature of the word. Right? And indeed, the nature of the Trinity is in early Christian art, and the nature of the humanity or divinity of Jesus is precisely fought over in images. You kind of think that's, because that isn't tomes and tomes and tomes of it, it appears to be rescued from the dead hand of the academic, but they're being argued about all the same. No image-free religion ever.
I'm
Show me one.
And well, I think Judaism has quite a good stab. Later Judaism, later Judaism, and it is, of course, one of the
Europa Synagogue?
I said later.
It's all right to be later if you've got some earlier. They're still around. Don't have to go on making them. Come on.
It does universalize, I think, not having an image. I think the word can be global. But I take Mary's point entirely about Islam. Dr. Afifi here in the Center of Islamic Studies talks about the Islamic notion of God as inverbation, that God was perceived through the word and only through the spoken word. And therefore the word is the nearest human apprehension of the divine. And particularly some of the great mosques where the word is all over the structure of the building, as you go into the building, you realize that this building is the word. And that is, of course, the kind of, the building becomes the imagery. Yeah. And the image of a house of God, which is a house of the word, literally and figuratively of the word. So I think I would have to concede.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, that was actually the last question from me, and our speakers have very kindly agreed to take questions from you. May I please request that you keep your questions and comments brief as possible, so that we can take in as many contributions to this discussion as possible. There are mics on the floor. If you raise your hands, Rabia is standing right there with a mic. Oh, there's one question here. And Vicky is standing back there, so if there are questions there, please.
So can I ask both Neil and Mary, throughout all religions, you've had this tension of iconoclasm and asceticism, rebelling very periodically against images. So I'd just be curious how you tie that in. With religions generally, it seems to be a theme throughout all religions that periodically we do get this rebellion against images.
Yes, shall I start? I think it's one of the questions, of course, is what is the nature of the image? Is the image a representation of the God, or is the image the God? And if you take something, and that's a very complicated one. It's something that exercises people very much. In many religions, particularly the non-European ones, it's absolutely, the non-Abrahamic ones, it's very clear that the image is the receptacle which now and then the God inhabits, but only now and then. And so the image itself has no value and can be disposed of. Once you bring the image and the God, the divine itself, closer together, then I think you're bound to have that kind of pressure and tension, and particularly, of course, with the prohibitions of the Jewish and of the Jewish scriptures, where it is felt by many to be wrong to make any image of that sort. But it's a very, I think what one sees is the need of humans to have images that let them focus and let them engage with the divine. And then the worry about others that it's taking them in the wrong direction, which is the Reformation model. But,
I can't claim to speak for asceticism. But I'm going to risk saying something about iconoclasm, even though there are people in the room who know a lot more about it than I do. I think what I've been struck by with iconoclasm, and not in every sense, but in quite a lot of the major religious cases of iconoclasm, what is extremely interesting is that it is not the destruction of the image tout court. That there's a picture in the catalogue for the exhibition, something which didn't come to the show, but it's a black basalt bust, probably a statue of Germanicus, Roman prince, which has had a cross engraved in his forehead, and he's had his earlobe slightly awkwardly removed. Now, when you look at that, that is, you can call that destruction, but it's actually inscribing one religion on another. It's creating a new work of art. And there's very little, there is some modern iconoclasm which does this, but there's very little iconoclasm in the history of iconoclasm which eradicates the image. What it does is it changes it, or it cuts its noses off, and it remains something which is both a kind of a record of religious conflict, which continues to be on display as a record of religious conflict, and it has a kind of artfulness in its broad terms in its own right. I was recently very struck by that in the Lady Chapel in Ely, which is one of the most classic bits of British iconoclasm. And you go in there, and it's full of images. Actually, it's full of images, but they're being made to tell you a different story. And I think iconoclasm often is a way of making the image tell a different story rather than eradicating the image tout court, I think.
That doesn't really square with what happens in Bamiyan.
Bamiyan was one of my counterexamples to myself.
Yeah. And I think it is a very powerful way of one religion attacking another.
Yeah, but it's
and
not,
that's a very, very, well, that's one of its purpose, I think, is precisely that.
But those total destruction cases are, so far as we know, and of course it's always very hard to track total destruction if it's successful, but those are unusual in the history of iconoclasm, which much more often falls into the creation of an artful reminder of victory.
Questions? More? Okay, right here. Front.
So far, we've talked very interestingly about visual images, but I was wondering also about auditory images. We talked about the smells of sacrifice, but there's, of course, chanting and hymns and the many other sounds of faith.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right, and that it comes back down to our definition of an image. And the more we define it in the terms of art history as a figurative image, then the more we don't see or perceive the smells and the sounds, which also add up to ways of imaging the divine. And in fact, the more you see that the word is essential, the more there's this, then the auditory ought to be part of our range of what it is to image something.
That's exactly right. I mean, you just as in the Islamic tradition, you inhabit the word by having it inscribed calligraphically on the walls of the mosque. In a great deal of the Christian tradition, you inhabit the word through plain song, through plain chant, and through musical, through singing of that sort. And there, the iconoclasm also has its pattern. Particularly in Scotland, the Puritans absolutely forbidding singing for a very, very long time because it distracted from the simple focus on the meaning of the word and took you into the distraction of beauty, which would take you back to earthly pleasures rather than divine truth.
And it is actually interesting that this is one of the places where the modern disciplinary boundaries of the academy, in broad terms, doesn't help us understand things. Because it's people in the music department who does the music, and it's people in art history who do the art.
So another complaint to the director of the Ashmolean.
Yeah.
I have a job to keep. There were some hands up at the back over there. I saw some up there on the steps. Are they still up? There's one right up there. Yes. Thank you.
Hi. We've talked a lot about imagery that describe divinity, but do you think there should be regulation on images that parody divinity? For example, Charlie Hebdo and depicting the Prophet Muhammad in such a way. Should there be a ban on those kind of images? Or does that add to the critical discussion on what is divinity?
Well, I think that's... I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm not sure there is an answer to that question because, it's like question of, free speech. This is always interlocutory free speech. But, I think that's where my donkey-headed Jesus on the cross as what I'm going to claim as the first Christian image in some way comes in, that, here we have, if we want to go back and trace, if I'm correct, the history of the image, that crucial Christian image, it starts with a parody of something we can't see. So, paradoxically, the first version of it is already the parody. It's a graffito, it's perhaps from the palace kitchens, we really don't know its context. There is a chance it's a fake, but let's assume it's not. Then I think that you can probably never put a clear blue water between the satiric and the non-satiric.
It is the most, as we all know, it's the most difficult question. And it's interesting, I think, that the power of the image in this area is so much stronger than the word. It's, as far as I know, there are far fewer instances of public distress, outrage, anger, because of written parodies, written criticisms of religious positions than of the visual ones, which I think is very interesting. The image is a much more powerful mechanism for carrying these ideas, not only because it translates internationally. It shows the precise point of the image, that the image lets you think differently and put the incompatible things together. And in this case, it's entirely a question of where you decide the level of offense is so great that it should not be allowed, where liberté butts up against fraternité, and where you draw that line in the case of the Charlie Hebdo images. But I think it demonstrates that nothing is as powerful in the religious debate as images.
And all the reasons that, all the upsides that we were talking about at the beginning, about what religions, how they depend on images, in a sense, that absolute essentialness of images is, in a way, academically, I'm not talking about any other sense here, it's academically shown by what happens in its converse.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, I just had a question. We've looked at images as stills, be they paintings or sculptures or part of architectural ornament, but we're moving into an age where images are dynamic, we're filming, and how that will influence the way that image making goes forward. And to touch on just something you said before about Bamyan, destroying the Buddhas at Bamyan is one thing, but filming yourself destroying the Buddhas at Bamyan is another thing, and is a way of consecrating that imposition of one religion as seen by a certain minority on another, in the same way as destroying a bridge at Mostar and filming it is a dynamic, interactive, repeatable act. And how does that work?
In a sense, I think that fits intellectually with what I was saying about iconoclasm, that we were drawing a distinction between the Buddhas of Bamyan and the iconoclastic act which leaves the object in place but with its mark. But in a sense, your point about the film is that the film of the act is doing the job of remembering the act. That, in my case of Germanicus, it is the mutilation of the ears and the cross on his forehead. That is the act of remembrance. But we now have more ways of constructing the act of memory in religious or any other terms than whatever early Christians it was mutilated Germanicus's ears.
And of course, the films have raised exactly the same questions as the cartoons, recently for decades, of the films being condemned because they misrepresent a religious act or something like The Life of Brian. Perfect example of the kind of offence that could give, but also how the visual image could take you into a whole set of new ways of thinking about it.
And I think that, without trying to make a plea for the utility of history, which doesn't often have utility, I think it is quite useful to try to see these new modes of recording or dissemination in a historical tradition. What is it that those are replacing? What is it that those, in what way does that better what kind of activity that was done? Can we see them not as something entirely new, but as a new modality of something that is actually very old?
Did I see a hand up there? Sorry, the lights are directly in our eyes, and so we can't see hands up. Okay, somewhere down there.
This is sort of related to the last question, but do you think that the extraordinary technology for the mass dissemination of images that we now have has made images less powerful or more powerful?
I don't think it really has changed very much, because as Mary was saying, it's simply a development of a historical phenomenon. The idea of reproducing the image more and more frequently has always been, certainly, if you take an example like the icon tradition in the Orthodox Church, the key point of that has always been to have one vision of a particular moment, a particular aspect of the life of Christ, usually with the Virgin. Once that's agreed, you then replicate. And quite the reverse, I think. The greater the replication, the greater the power of the image. Because if you take those icons, particularly an icon like the icon of Our Lady of Kazan, who becomes the protectress of Russia, the part of the power of that image is precisely that there is not just one, but that every replication of it has the same power, and that when you're looking at it, millions of other people are also looking at the same thing. And I think that mass replication of the image allows a community of lookers to be built up. And I would see it as potentially a very powerful addition to the strength of the image, if you know that what you look at, what you recognize, is similarly and perhaps even simultaneously being looked at and recognized by millions of other people all around the world.
Yeah, it seems to me it's a new medium and it's a new modality, and that can be shocking because it is reaching us in different ways. But to use a trivial example to compare that to, if you think of social media in general, I don't think that social media have turned people into nasty, abusive characters when they weren't anyway. I think they have provided a different way for us to perceive that kind of and to be nasty. And I think it's very similar, although rather clearly at a different level in the dissemination by film and by YouTube of those kind of events. I don't think that people are necessarily doing something fundamentally different.
Shall we take one last question, please?
Is this on? Okay. Thank you very much. I may have missed something in the exhibition, but if I'm right, is it a shortcoming that there are no female representations of the divine? Did I miss something? Sorry, I didn't see any. I didn't spot any. I saw lots of men. I saw lots of blobs. I saw lots of words, but no women.
This is a question for Mary.
Oh, thank you, Neil. You didn't see any blobs either. And you mean, there was I complaining that there were no planks. And I very tactfully didn't complain that there were no women. I have to say, I'm afraid, I suspect you're right. And it's interesting to look at myself and to see how far I, like many, have largely internalized the absence of women in the great world religions. We've even been talking about God as He, and at every event like this needs a question like that just to wake us up a bit. Thank you very much. You're right.
I don't know why I was dreading this. That was really enjoyable. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking both of them, Mary Beard and Neil MacGregor. Thank you.